Well, hello, welcome. Welcome to the living room of the Architecture Association. And this is another field forum series. And just hi, Tim, can you hear us? Okay.
I can hear you. Hello.
Okay, great. your eyes are very prominent. Your eyes are there. So I'll do a little bit of introduction. So again, for those who just come, help yourself with the drink and come forward. Feel free to come forward. It's supposed to be a casual conversation evening. So this series field forum, we center the interconnectedness embedded in the built environment, and we invite people we find inspiring and their work, how to attune our senses to material flows, planetary scales, intergenerational times, and all the lives entangled in these processes. So the series is curated by two of us. My name is Cyan, and I'm an AA graduate. It's just nice to come back here after some years. And I'm also the curator of the exhibition just opposite the hallway, Rippling. And this is Chen. We are co-curating the series and co-curating the exhibition. So we have, as you can see, 4 sessions. Planetary everyday, material in the field, senses and sense making, and then literal telling. So we always have this kind of sitting floor-based format, have film screening, records on the turntable, and it's conversation-based. And so far we have discussed the coming into being of things with artist Jessie Darling. And last week, we talked about ice core media and seabed sense. And today, we're going to talk about the turn of the ground, land reclamation, and resistance. And next time will be hydrosociality and hydropolitics. So that's the theory. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Tim Ingold, who I suppose doesn't really need much introduction. So Tim has written many influential books, say The Perception of the Environment, Making, the Theory on the Line, Correspondence, and most recently, The Rise and Fall of Generation Now. I'm just going to share a little bit personally for us how our ongoing work of tracing sand is indebted to Tim's thinking, particularly in how his conceptual reading of things destabilizes any static stable perception of the world around us, say the ground, the solid fluids, and the materials. So Tim talks about materials via what materials do instead of what they are. So materials are really stories of what happens to the material. And we are trying to prove these notions into practice through our tracing sand journey along the Mekong River in Southeast Asia, basically to unpack the coming into being of architectural iconic sites via sand as a field guide. And also in this process, it really brings our own becoming into correspondence with sand and its flow. So we are very fortunate that this work brings about the field forum, which then brings us in correspondence with your team. Sorry, I should look at that. Welcome to the AA.
So, hello? Yes. So I'd like to also warmly welcome Michaela to the AA. So Michaela is an interdisciplinary researcher and artist currently based in Berlin. And she's postdoctoral fellow at the TU Dresden in Germany and associated investigator for matters of activity, image, space, material. Her research focuses on the spatial and material transformations in the context of speculative urbanism, climate change mitigation, and energy transitions. There are a lot of crossovers on the topic of sand, on the way we trace sand as material, and also on the site we are looking at. So I think today she's going to present the field work from land reclamation projects in the Netherlands, Singapore, and Malaysia, following the story of sand from a natural material to an engineered urban landscape. So I'll now pass on to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cyan and Chen, for the kind invitation. Actually going to mostly speak about Malaysia because some of you might have seen already the film work that we showed just before, which focuses on a land reclamation project in Malacca, Malaysia. So I decided, since we're showing the work, I'd also going to talk about that. But you're very invited to ask me questions about Netherlands and Singapore as well. Although land reclamation takes place all around the world, in Southeast Asia it is tantamount to real estate speculation. Nowhere else is sand such a controversial material, nor is the politics of its transformation so contested. The term reclaim suggests taking something back as if it was an original possession. In contemporary usage, however, it means creating land and water and thus extending territory beyond pre-existing boundaries. The replenishment or nourishment of beaches is a common practice, especially in tourist destinations. Harbors are usually built on reclaimed land, or dredging and disposal of sand may be part of the construction process. Land reclamation is used to mitigate the effects of climate change, such as sea level rise, beach erosion, and coastal retreat, and frequently coincides with industrial and real estate development. The environmental and social impacts associated with sand mining and land reclamation are often overshadowed by shiny visions of waterfront development, economic growth, and international acclaim. While small-scale reclamation might go unnoticed by those who are not directly involved in the process, large-scale reclamation, such as the construction of new harbor fronts or offshore islands, boldly illustrate the massive amounts of sand that are constantly being transformed in the name of speculative urbanism. Sand, land, territory, and by extension governance are visibly converging through land reclamation. The often speculative nature of these projects raises questions about the economics and politics of sand. Land reclamation, when used as a speculative investment or a geopolitical tool, turns sand into an asset. Singapore has long been at the forefront of land reclamation in Southeast Asia. The city-state has expanded its territory by a quarter over the past 50 years and is aiming for a total expansion of 30% by 2030. Territorial transformation and expansion are seen as central to Singapore's nation-building project and its rise from, quote-unquote, urban squalor to global city. While the illegal sourcing of sand and the associated social and environmental impacts of sand mining and reclamation are being challenged by activists and scholars in the region, Singapore's story continues to fuel aspirations to follow suit. For neighboring Malaysia, this quest is unique, given both the countries' shared history and material entanglements. Until 1965, Singapore was part of Malaysia, and Malaysian sand makes up the vast majority of Singapore's new landmass. Over the past decade, Malaysia has seen a proliferation of land reclamation projects, stretching from Johor in the far south of the peninsula to Penang, an island in the north. Driven by an often blind ambition to catch up with Singapore, these projects also serve as investment opportunities for Chinese companies and individuals in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. Launched by the Chinese government in 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative is a large-scale infrastructure project designed to facilitate the renewal of the former Silk Road, the trade route between East and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, East Africa, and Southern Europe. As part of the project, China is investing heavily in overseas infrastructure, such as ports, railways, pipelines, fiber optic cables, and artificial land. Among Chinese infrastructure development in Southeast Asia, Malaysia has seen the most investment. Here, access along the Malay Peninsula is particularly important to China because of the so-called Malacca dilemma. That is the potential threat to China's oil supply by Singapore's power in the region. Currently, China is the world's largest importer of oil, with 80% of its supply having to pass through the Strait of Malacca. The most extensive development took place in Malacca, a former port city located halfway between Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. During the 14th and 15th centuries, Malacca was an important port city in the region, facilitating trade between Indian, East Asian, and Southeast Asian merchants. Successive occupations by Portuguese, Dutch, and British colonialists, which resulted in the racial aggregation of Malacca's multi-ethnic population, as well as the growing economic and geopolitical importance of nearby Singapore, are said to have led to the gradual abandonment of the once vibrant trading center. When Malaysia's former Prime Minister, Najib Razak, initiated cooperation with China in early 2014, he called for Malacca's pre-colonial glory as the vibrant cultural and commercial center of Southeast Asia to be restored through the signature project called Malacca Gateway. Consisting of 3 man-made islands, Malacca Gateway would bring back the cosmopolitan appeal of the old days, packaged in a futuristic design. Spanning 4 man-made islands and 1,500 acres, the project was expected to bring an additional 2.5 million tourists to Malacca annually. Scheduled to be completed by 2025, it would give Malacca the largest private marina in Southeast Asia, capable of accommodating up to 4 cruise ships at a time, with a capacity of 8 million containers per year. Despite these wildly ambitious plans, former Prime Minister and then Minister of Finance Najib Razak backed the project and granted it freehold status. However, the project began to stagnate shortly after its inception. Since its launch in 2014, the state government has called off development several times, with the latest notice of termination being issued in November 2020. In 2023, after a 3-year hiatus, Sultan Ibrahim Ismail of Johor, who is also backing the reclamation project in Johor, became a major shareholder and revived plans to continue work on the project, though in a reduced scale. Nearly a decade after its initiation, only a fraction of the designated coastal area has been reclaimed, and development of the new land continues to stagnate. Instead, the coast is lined with strips of barren land and piles of sand awaiting processing and silting up waterways. With each wave of the project's reformation, new layers of dredged marine sand are deposited on Malacca's coast. The shifting coastal morphology mirrors the ups and downs of the project. Heaps of dump sand at the eastern end of the coast, silted strips at the western end, and in between several half-finished and abandoned reclamation sites. A new pattern of segregation has overturned Malacca's previous occupations, disconnecting the population from direct access to the sea. The uneven accumulation of capital and sand that drives the sedimentary configurations that make up Malacca's eclectic form creates unwanted contingencies with its colonial past. Unlike visions for Malacca Gateway that can easily be altered on the drawing board, the fallow coastline bears witness to these past futures, buried alive. In this presentation, I trace the sedimentary configurations that constitute Malacca's apparent abandonment and provide the ground for unexpected forms of life and sociality to emerge. Sand is the medium and material through which I connect the eclectic landscapes forms, transnational capital flows, and complicated post-colonial identity politics with more subtle practices of resistance. Sedimentary configurations refers to the geosocial formations that make up our present. This analysis is based on the call to geolize the social, as articulated by geographers Katrin Youssef and Nigel Clark, in order to highlight the interdependence of social and geological processes, life and non-life, and the dynamic patterns through which they form and regroup. By emphasizing the role of sand as more than just a material for land reclamation, but as a medium for exploring the messy connections between capital, human, and non-human existence, the story of Malacca Gateway highlights the entanglements between extractive capitalism and attempts to subvert it. I employ the term reclamation in two ways, as a physical project and as an act of resistance. In this context, I use the granular physics of sand to show how attempts to accumulate material and transform the shoreline collide with the material's tendency to erode, resulting in unintended patterns of sedimentation that prepare the ground for other futures to emerge. Malacca Gateway, that is, its existing physical fragments, loom large over Malacca's coastline. When I visited in January 2020, reclamation was still underway, but construction seemed to have paused for a while. Untamed weeds grew randomly on the new land and in between unfinished houses. Some buildings were unplastered, without roofs, doors, or windows. Others seemed finished but abandoned. The sea had receded for several hundred meters, perhaps kilometers, exposing a long strip of silted terrain and occasional puddles of water. It was interrupted only by huge patches of sand that extend to the existing island number 1, the island that would house tourist and entertainment facilities. The bridge that will connect the mainland to Malacca Island is not frequented by any cars or pedestrians. It's very quiet on the island, which adds to the desolate experience of the place. Posters here and there recall the sales pitch that promised multi-story integrated amusement parks and cruise vacations, but their colors have faded, leaving little hope that these promises will ever come to fruition. The only people working on the island are security guards protecting the entrances to empty slots of barren land and half-built houses, construction sites turned into ruins. When I ask to enter one of the sites, the guard's refusal is almost apologetic, as if he does not see the reason to protect the site at all. One of the buildings that appears to be finished is located at the entrance of the island, facing the mainland. Called the Riviera, it is supposed to house restaurants, cafes, and even a hotel, according to Google Maps. But it's completely empty, the doors are locked, and the windows seem dirty from blowing sand and dust. As I walk around the building, I notice a small architectural model of the complex behind the dusty glass. It looks like an exact copy of the building I'm standing in front of. Comparing the model and the building, both seem equally lifeless and eerie. But there is an important difference. The small model behind the dusty glass can easily be discarded, but the large one is a silent memorial to a promise that was never fulfilled. Encountering them together, one nested within the other, highlights the difference between two modes of speculation. The architectural model, as a supposedly naive artifact detached from time and place, conceals its political function. It projects a vision that has no place. The building, on the other hand, is designed according to the model and will eventually be confronted with its context, a context that is irreversibly altered by its presence. The model behind the dusty glass is not affected by what happens around it, but the actual building and with it the entire island are slowly decomposing. In addition to causing irritation and siltation, their decomposition foregrounds the disconnect between bright visions of a globalized future and their material and social foundations and repercussions. The ghost town that is Malacca Gateway is not the only unfinished and abandoned reclamation site in Malacca. In fact, the announcements of the Belt and Road Initiative plans brought with it all kinds of developments initiated by Chinese investors and the local government, such as the sale, Encore Malacca, and Depression City Malacca. Like Malacca Gateway, they combine land reclamation, tourist facilities, and cruise terminals. Also similar to Malacca Gateway, their sites are largely undeveloped and silted. The space of the speculative is instructive here, as they incentivize investments that pay off by further fueling speculation. In this context, speculative refers not only to the projective nature of these projects, but also the fact that they capitalize on a vision of the future that may or may not ever become manifest. The speculative investment that always accompanies land reclamation, whether as protection against future floods or as a means to future profits, becomes an end in itself. In Malacca, expectations drive investment, which drives development, which leads to more investment and more development, a process seemingly detached from material and social reality. The plastic nature of sand conceived as both infinitely malleable and attainable, drives this process, creating islands and buildings and shaping land, concrete, steel, and glass. At the same time, sandy infrastructures are constantly decomposing and shifting form, eroding the physical side and the visions attached to it. The simultaneous accumulation and disintegration of sand along the coast of Malacca represents the flows of capital as partial and unstable sedimentations. Building a future on sand, literally and metaphorically, exposes the instability of the ground as both conducive to the appropriation of the built form and beyond its control. At the northern end of Malacca's 10-kilometer reclaimed coastline is a place with a promising name of Malacca Sand Dunes. It is not part of any official tourist guide, as it is a rather accidental addition to the recreational landscape. Trending on Instagram and several local travel blogs, it is considered an insider recommendation, a place to stroll and take pictures. Most of the images have a similar layout: people posing on top of dunes at sunset, people jumping off dunes suspended in midair, couples embracing between dunes. Next to their images are inspirational quotes, reflections on their lives, and comments on the beauty of the place. What are described as dunes are in fact piles of sand that have formed when trucks unload on a reclamation site before bulldozers spread the sand and level the surface. But the bulldozers never arrived and the sand was left behind. However, the unfinished reclamation process is usually not mentioned in the descriptions of the images. Instead, the place is praised as a tranquil nature retreat. Walking through the dunes, I can see how the former construction site has been reclaimed by the forces of wind and waves, which have softened the tops of the piles and spread the seeds of wheat that now hold the sand in place. Today, the dunes are overgrown with vegetation, and several dredging boats are parked nearby. Some of them are stranded and rusting. Paddles have formed between the piles, resembling small mountain lakes. The spot feels displaced. Despite their organic shapes, I understand that the dunes did not form here spontaneously, but are a byproduct of the unfinished reclamation process. The simultaneous natural and artificial nature of this place has become an attraction in and of itself, inviting a level of engagement not previously considered and offering the possibility of reclaiming a part of the coast. The eerie existence of the dunes is a reminder that land, especially coastal land, is never stable to begin with. This transience is reflected in the comments of visitors, who the dunes seem to invite to ponder on their relationship to time and place. Nevertheless, the Malacca government remains invested in the site's future development potential, calling upon the malleable nature of sand. Martin Teixeira, spokesperson of the Portuguese community in Malacca, tells me that the stagnant reclamation sites and sand deposits are framed as a land bank that can quickly be reactivated when needed. Despite declining investors' interest in further coastal development and the devastating results of previous reclamation efforts, the government maintains its vision to revive the old port city, albeit in an indefinite future. The sand that is temporarily parked here is understood in terms of its potential to take the form of land and commercial infrastructure and thus produce value. As this future is indefinitely postponed, The same material invites residents and visitors to experience a landscape fallen out of place. While the dunes on Malacca's west coast are seen as a positive side effect of the unfinished reclamation work, providing a surprisingly new creational landscape, the eastern part of the city is plagued by siltation and drainage problems. This particularly affects the Portuguese community living here. The Cristang community is one of the last remaining communities of Portuguese descent in Southeast Asia. They rely on fishing as a source of income and, more importantly, as a way of identification. The prime site they inhabit used to face the ocean, where several restaurants served Portuguese-style fish dishes freshly caught only hours before. The reclamation of Malacca Gateway has turned the thin strip of ocean between the coast and the island of Malacca into a stinking field of mud. Sand eroded and blown off the island has silted up the shallow shore, forming a thick layer of sludge that has forced the sea to retreat several hundred meters. As the sea has receded, so have the fish populations. I met Tessera at the community center on the edge of what used to be the coast. The restaurants and hotels are empty. The hum of air conditioning from the nearby hotel fills the air. The fishermen's boats are stranded on the mud next to the community square. Cristang residents are despondent over the loss of their livelihoods and the ever-present stench of sludge. One of the major repercussions for us is the psychological effect. Many people do not talk about it, but they feel it, explains Tessera. As I learned not only from him, but on several other occasions during my travels in Southeast Asia, fishermen strongly identify with their work. They fish until they die, and many die while fishing. Not being able to go out to the sea anymore and not being able to see the sea is something that development cannot outweigh, if they are to benefit from it at all. Sorry, my voice is very dry. Tessera is connected to several other fishing communities in Malaysia and Southeast Asia, whose livelihoods are threatened by sand mining and land reclamation. Many of them mount concerted actions against the implementation of development projects, often supported by environmental activists, but they are rarely successful, resulting at best in compensation payments to the affected communities. In Malacca, the situation is a different one because of the city's strategy to utilize its colonial past to strike new markets. As the dissidents of Portuguese colonists, the Cristang have been able to use their special status to gain recognition and support from the government. Tessera, now an intermediary between the state government and the community, argued for the cultural importance of the Cristang community, especially for the way they have shaped the local cuisine and thus attracted national and international tourists. Their local holiday, Festa da San Pedro, named after St. Peter's, the patron saint of fishermen and sailors, has become a tourist magnet. Unfortunately, this will not bring back the sea or the sand, but the homestay business has become a new and lucrative avenue for the community. The unique situation of the Portuguese community in Malacca allowed them to buy into the city's heritage strategy and ensure their survival, if only as a tourist destination. The twisted logic of heritage is striking in that it builds on Malacca's past occupation to entice new forms of colonization through foreign investment and tourist development. The Portuguese community is thus trapped in its own history of colonization as the only way to endure this new wave of extraction. It is in this history that gives them a competitive edge in their struggle for existence. However, it is this history that gives them a competitive edge in their struggle for existence. On the initiative of the community, Malacca recently renewed its Twin City agreement with Lisbon, further strengthening international relations and promoting Malacca as a destination for Portuguese tourists. Born out of a desire to reclaim Malacca's past, Malacca Gateway is based on speculations about a future that seems to be out of touch with the ground it is built upon. Visions of the project are constantly under construction, as is the shoreline. Substrate and effect of the ongoing limbo that conflates urban and economic development strategies and post-colonial identity politics, Malacca's coastline comes to express capital flows as partial and unstable sedimentations. Sand is the central element through and around which these contradictory transformations unfold. Its granular nature makes it easy to extract, smooth to transport, and most importantly, solidify into land. These processes are driven by the desire to control land and ensure economic growth. However, reclaimed sites might be occupied, altered, or redeveloped in unexpected ways, allowing for engagement that was previously not considered. When I passed by Malacca Gateway, after Teixeira had alerted me to the siltation and drainage problems caused by the project, I could not help but smell the foul air. At first, all I saw was sandy mud stretching from the shoreline to the island. It appeared to be a homogeneous mass, disrupted only by puddles of water and occasional vegetation. But upon closer inspection, I realized that the ground is in fact vibrant, populated by hundreds and thousands of crawling little creatures. Half fish, half lizards. The mudskippers are barely visible because they have the same beige-gray color as the ground they dwell on and in. They move very slowly, sometimes not at all, and you have to stop, get used to the smell, and then wait patiently to be able to distinguish them from their background. They can live without water for several months, using their skin to breathe oxygen instead. When it gets dry, they dig deep into the sandy bottoms and wait for wetter days. Their hybrid state seems made for this environment, an accidental byproduct of a failed reclamation project. And while the surrounding construction sites are abandoned and lifeless, the mudskippers thrive in their habitat. It is a soothing, almost peaceful scene amidst the surreal landscape. While the future of Malacca seems to depend on whether Chinese interest in the location returns, another story begins to emerge from the remnants of the reclamation project. In the temporary opening created by the stagnation of the reclamation work, mudskippers dwelling in ruins and sand piles disguised as dunes are opportunities to engage with the nature of the changing coastline. These emerging ecologies cannot restore the lost livelihoods or undo environmental harm, but they offer a chance to reflect on the dynamic interplay between destruction and renewal. They remind us to approach such landscapes with a sense of curiosity and care, challenging the extractive practices that created them, while noticing the unexpected ways life persists and adapts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Michaela, also. You obviously had to struggle with that voice. That's a heroic effort, and I appreciated it. But I'd like to begin by reading short excerpts from the works of two very different authors. The first is the Scottish author Nan Shepherd, a native of the city of Aberdeen, where I also live. Shepherd was a teacher by profession, but also a keen walker who spent many long days roaming the Cairngorm Mountains. And during the 1940s, she wrote a little book in praise of the Cairngorms. Entitled The Living Mountain, it was left in a desk drawer and not published until 1977. And even then, few knew of the book, and only in the last few years has it emerged as a classic of Scottish literature, so celebrated indeed that Shepherd's portrait now appears on £5 banknotes issued by the Bank of Scotland. So here she is. And here she is too, describing what it feels like to stretch out on the mountain top. I'll just read it out. So there I lie on the plateau, under me the central core of fire from which was thrust this rumbling, grinding mass of plutonic rock. Over me the blue air, and between the fire of the rock and the fire of the sun, scree, soil and water, moss, grass, flower and tree, insect, bird and beast, wind, rain and snow, the total mountain. Slowly, I have found my way in. Well, my second author is the ecological psychologist James Gibson, whose classic monograph, called The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, was first published in 1979. Gibson begins by setting out the key constituents of the terrestrial environment as they would manifest themselves to a perceiver placed within it. The environment consists, he says, of three components, namely a medium, substances, and the surfaces that separate substances from the medium. So just to continue in his words, our planet consists mainly of earth, water, and air. That is, a solid, a liquid, and a gas. The earth forms a substratum. The water is formed by the substratum into oceans, lakes, and streams. And the formless gases of the air make a layer of atmosphere above the earth and the water. The interface between any two of these three states of matter, solid, liquid, and gas, constitutes a surface. The earth-water interface at the bottom of a lake is one such. The water-air interface at the top of the lake is another. And the earth-air interface is a third. The most important of all the surfaces for terrestrial animals. This is the ground. It is the ground of their perception and behavior, both literally and figuratively. It is their surface of support. So let's compare these two passages. For both Shepherd and Gibson, atmospheric air is up above, and the earth is deep down below. But what lies between sky and earth? Well, for Gibson, it's the ground, conceived as a solid platform of support. Here's the ground, a solid platform of support that separates the air above from the earth below. But for Shepherd, what lies between is, well, everything, what she calls the total mountain. So what's going on here? And how can there be such different views? And which is right? In Gibson's characterization, as we've seen, the ground is what he calls an earth-air interface. Now, by definition, an interface has two sides. It could be a top side and an underside, or an outside and an inside. And while the interface serves to keep the two sides separate, confined to their respective domains, it is also perforated by holes or keys that allow information and sometimes materials to pass from one side to the other. A metalled road or pavement, for example, could be perforated by drains that allow rainwater through to underground channels, or by manholes that allow human access to subsurface infrastructure. But the paved surfaces of the city, of course, also provide support for its inhabitants. Indeed, the campaign to pave the urban environment in the modern era was driven above all by its twin functions of support and separation. On the one hand, the paved surface provided a secure foundation for fast and efficient transport, above all by means of wheeled vehicles, which might otherwise become stuck in mud or be overturned by surface irregularities. On the other hand, paving was considered of benefit to public health, since it seals the ground, preventing the stench of the earth from rising into the air, where it was believed to cause illness among those who breathed it. And yet, on a paved surface, nothing can grow. For growth to occur, it's necessary for carbon dioxide in the air to bind with rainfall already absorbed into the soil and taken up by the roots in the presence of sunlight. This is photosynthesis, and all life depends on it. So in the growth of living things, earth and air meet and mingle. And where the ground has been paved, growth is only possible through cracks in the pavement. That is, until the surface itself, overwhelmed by the elemental forces of earth and air, eventually crumbles. Where's my voice? So let's now leave the city for the countryside, or join with shepherd in the mountains. Here, the ground is not paved, and its surface has only one side, not two. It is not an interface, it's not hard, and for plants at least, it is not a surface of support, but a medium. Plants grow in the ground, they don't rest upon it. What matters to the plant is the depth to which light can penetrate. And from the plant's point of view, indeed, the ground is not really a coherent foundation at all, but an indistinct and permeable limit of illumination, above which it shoots out green leaves, but below which it adopts the different habit of root growth. This is actually a drawing from a sketch from Paul Clay's sketchbook. It shows the plants with the root at the root area at the bottom, the stalk, and the flower at the top. And he's showing how the plant is really something that mediates this relationship between the ground and the air. So how can we describe this kind of surface? Well, to answer this question, I'd like to draw an analogy between the ground of habitation and the page of writing. It is an ancient analogy which can even be traced etymologically to the origin of the English word page, which comes from the Latin pagus, meaning an area of inhabited countryside with its farms and fields, from which also we get the English word peasant for the farmer and the French word paysage for the landscape he tends. So the act of writing with pen on parchment would then be likened to the act of tilling the fields with the plough. And in the days when almost everyone knew how to handle a plough, but few could write, it was a natural comparison to make. Now, of course, the situation is reversed. Almost everyone can write, but how many still know how to handle the plough? So on the left here, this is the frontispiece from a 14th century copy of Piers Plowman. And on the right is it depicts Bishop Lawrence, the prior of Durham, in the 12th century. He's hard at work writing with his writing. Now, the parchment that medieval scribes used for their principal writing material was highly absorbent. It was also very expensive. And for that reason, it was common for, just a second. For that reason, it was common for the same material to be used over and over again. To reuse a parchment that has already been written upon, you have first to scrape the surface with a knife so as to remove as much of that original trace as possible. And you can then write again. And in principle, you can repeat this operation over and over again until eventually the parchment is scraped so thin that it's no longer usable. But since the material is so absorbent, the traces of previous writing can never be completely removed. So on a parchment that has been used several times, recent inscriptions appear to be cut through the ever fainter traces of earlier ones, giving rise to what students of writing call the palimpsest. And this here is a palimpsest from the 13th century, and you can see behind it, or perhaps in front of it, you'll see the traces of a text actually in Greek from the 6th century. So this is an example of a parchment that has been used, in this case, twice. Now, modern readers who are conditioned by their familiarity with the printed word can all too easily jump to the conclusion that the formation of the palimpsest is equivalent to overprinting, in which one layer of inscription is simply added on over another. But a closer look at how the palimpsest is formed reveals it to be precisely the opposite. And so let me explain by means of a diagram. It took me a long time to work this one out, so I hope I can explain it to you. What it shows is a parchment in exaggerated cross-section, so that the horizontal line is like the surface of the parchment, and the vertical lines represent marks of ink which are soaked in. So each line of ink appears as a vertical mark, as wide as the line is thick, and as deep as the ink sinks into the parchment. And in the diagram, I've indicated two lines inscribed at time t0. So our initial time, t0, here's the surface of the parchment, and I've drawn a line here and a line here, and they have sunk in so much. Remember, this is very, very, very magnified, so it looks as though the ink has sunk in a long way. Well then, I want to use this parchment again. So at some time later, t1, I scrape the surface as much as I can. So I scrape it down to here, and then I make two more lines of ink, which similarly sink in. This one down here, and this one down here. And then I want to get a third line. And so I scrape it again at a later time, t2, and again do the same thing, inscribe two new lines. Well, now, looking at time t2, just look at what has happened to the traces. The original traces from time t0 are only just visible right next to the surface, and will certainly disappear if the parchment is used again. The traces from t1 are shallower than they were, but still clear. Here they are. And the traces from t2 are the deepest of all, these ones here. So far from inscriptions sinking ever further down as new ones are added on top, quite the reverse occurs. It's the past that rises even as it is undercut by the present. So here, these are the oldest ones, and they are the closest to the surface. Now, it's just the same with the ground. Archaeologists in particular have seized upon the metaphor of the palimpsest to refer to a ground that over the ages has been repeatedly used, eroded, and used again. And one of the originators of the analogy, the archaeologist Osbert Crawford, writing in the early 1950s, expressed it thus: "The surface of England is like a palimpsest, a document that has been written on and erased over and over again, and it is the business of the field of archaeology to decipher it. The features concerned are, of course, the roads and field boundaries, the woods, the farms, and other habitations, and the other products of human labour. These are the letters and words inscribed on the land." Now, setting aside the nationalist tenor of his remarks, I'd like to draw attention to the paradox they embody, namely that it sets archaeologists to work in deciphering traces of a past that, by rights, should have already been erased by the present. That there is something left for them to work on is an index of the fact that the erasure is never complete, that something always remains. Suppose, for example, that you're surveying a landscape for evidence of ancient trackways. The most ancient tracks, worn by feet from centuries past, are now barely visible traces on the surface, on the point of vanishing. It could take a specialist eye to see them. And unless artificially preserved, the weather will soon wipe them out altogether. So here we are on the left is the remains of a Roman road in Yorkshire, in the north of England, would once have been very, very prominent. Now you can barely see the stones from the grass. But by contrast, the newest incisions, recently cut in the landscape and not yet subject to significant erosion, are strongly marked. Like on the right of the picture here, this is a rather modern road cutting in Fife in Scotland. And in between these two extremes are historic traces that, while manifestly weather-beaten and sometimes obscured, are still easy to recognize. So in the land, just as on parchment, the past is not buried under the present, but actually closest to the surface, while the present, undercutting the past, digs deepest. The past comes up as the present goes down. And this is not so much a layering as a turning over. So keep this idea in mind of turning over, because I'll return to it in a moment. Now, if the ground were an interface between the substances of the Earth and the atmospheric medium, as Gibson imagined, then it would look in cross-section something like this. So we've got the sphere, the atmosphere above, the Earth below, and here's the ground as an interface between them. But outside the paved environment of the city, the ground has no topside or underside. It doesn't hold the Earth and atmosphere apart. On the contrary, as Shepard understood, it is the zone of their interpenetration. It is a palimpsest. The ground, as palimpsest, doesn't separate the Earth from the sky or serve as an interface mediating exchanges between the two. It is rather where Earth and sky are rolled into one, where rain meets soil and turns it to mud, where wind meets sand and blows it into dunes, where snow meets ice and coats the surface in a blanket of white. Here, to recall Shepard's words, between blue sky and bedrock are screen, soil and water, moss, grass, flower and tree, insect, bird and beast, wind, rain and snow. So the ground, thus understood, exemplifies what I want to call a deep surface, formed as the Earth's rising up, or eruption, meets the atmosphere's beating down, or erosion. And this ground has depth, but is of no measurable thickness. Should we attempt to measure it, we would find that starting from the lower atmospheric horizon, there is no limit to how up we could go, or starting conversely from the upper earthly horizon, there is no limit to how far down one could go. And I hope this diagram, which is a kind of inversion of the previous one, shows you what I mean. And the double meaning of the English word to wear, the verb to wear, aptly illustrates this understanding of the ground as a deep surface. The word can mean to put on, as in wearing clothes, but it can also mean to strip off, as a surface that is worn by use or by exposure to the elements. Now, if the surface was an interface, then these meanings would directly contradict one another. But with the palimpsest, they are one and the same, because it's in the very process of erosion that depth comes to the surface. This is a surface that covers, but doesn't cover up. And such, indeed, is the surface of the ground. It covers, but does not cover up. One thinker who came close to picturing the ground in these terms was the Victorian critic and connoisseur John Ruskin. Introducing the fifth and final volume of his Modern Painters, published in 1860, Ruskin described the ground, and these are his words, as a veil of strange intermediate being. At bottom, Ruskin argued, the earth is dead and cold, but at its surface, in the textures and meadows, the textures of its meadows and forests, its rocky outcrops, moor and heath, it ministers to its inhabitants through this veil. Perhaps then we could follow Ruskin in thinking of the ground as a veil of intermediacy rather than a plane of separation. Ruskin himself began with the injunction to dress it and keep it. Dressing here is an act of care, of looking after. The veil covers, but does not cover up. It is a revelation, not a disguise. And imagined as a veil, the ground doesn't hide the earth's depth beneath its surface, but allows us to feel the depth in its surface. But the ground can also deceive. And this is how camouflage works. It tricks the perceiver into supposing that what is actually an interfacial double-sided surface, covering up the things hidden within or beneath, is really a one-sided deep surface open to the sky rather than closed off against it. Such is the face of the earth. And just as the face of a human being presents a front without a back, so the open ground has no other side. And with no other side, it appears to have nothing to hide. It covers, but doesn't cover up. So the military commander paints the tarpaulins under which he conceals his tanks in motley shades of green and brown, rendering them indistinguishable to aerial reconnaissance from the Earth's surface in its embrace of the sky. That's what I try to draw here. These things here are tanks. So I'm a military commander and I want to hide my tanks so the enemy won't see them when they fly overhead. So I cover it in tarpaulin and paint the tarpaulin in all kinds of shades of green and brown. So when somebody flies over it, they think it's just like that. It's just part of the Earth. And being part of the Earth, which simply has one side, not two, it's not hiding anything at all. So that's how camouflage works. It deceives us into thinking that what is actually the two-sided surface, the tarpaulin, is just the one-sided surface of the Earth. Now, I want to loop back to the idea of turning by bringing in another concept, namely volume. And this is a word that comes from the Latin volvere, meaning to roll. And so it's cognate with such words as evolution and revolution. So the original volume was a scroll of papyrus or parchment, usually inscribed with writing. And to read it, the scroll had to be unrolled or evolved, after which it would be rolled up again or revolved. But later, as the scroll gave way to the manuscript book or codex, the continuous roll would be folded into sheets like a concertina, so that the reader, rather than unrolling the volume, would turn its pages, opening up each fold only to close its predecessor behind. So that's the scroll, this is the codex. The scroll is, now, on turning the page of the codex, here, one turns the page, recto to verso, what was once over goes under, and what was under goes over. But there is no going through. Because although every sheet had two sides, it was not an interface. Rather, like the mythical Janus, the page was two-faced. And the only way to get from one face or side to the other was by the simultaneous folding and unfolding of the turn. But the codex, as here, was always open, regardless of the particular page to which it was turned. Not until the manuscript was replaced by the printed word was the book finally closed. Because in the printed book, the pages are laid one over another to form a stack. And although you still have to turn the pages to read it, the book itself is now perceived as a thing of layered sheets to be worked through top to bottom as beginning to end. So So that's with the codex, you have to turn the pages. This is what a modern book looks like, with a stack of sheets. And that's why we typically think of the volume these days as a three-dimensional box or container to be filled with contents. We've moved, if you like, from the voluminous to the volumetric. Now, I've already compared the page and the ground. So has the ground undergone a parallel transformation from turnover to stack? Well, it's true that you can't exactly roll up the ground like a scroll, but you can turn it. Put yourself in the shoes of the medieval plowman. Go back to him. Here he is on the left. Put yourself in the shoes of the medieval plowman, who would turn the ground with every turn of the seasons in the agricultural calendar. The purpose of ploughing is to bring up to the surface nutrient-rich soil from deep down, while burying soil already drained of nutrients by previous cropping, along with any remaining weeds and stubble. And thanks to this continual turnover, the ground will continue to yield year after year. It is repeatedly renewed, not by adding layer upon layer as in a stack, but by breaking it, cutting through with the share so as to raise the deep and bury the shallow. And that's what makes the ground surface, like the scroll and the codex, into a volume. It's a surface that turns with the seasonal passage of time, with the alternations of weather and the husbandry of crops, wherein the past rises up even as the present sinks below. This is the ground not just of cultivation, but of memory. For with its turning, memories of persons that lived or events that happened long ago are brought to the surface so that inhabitants can engage with them directly, as if present in the here and now. But with the volume being reconceived as a box or container, however, its contents layered into a stack, as on the right here, time no longer rolls, folds, or turns the ground. It rather pierces through successive grounds like an arrow, pointing either upwards from past to present, or downwards from present to past. Here, every ground, every layer establishes its own plane of synchrony, while layer succeeds layer in a diachronic sequence. To reach the past, as in archaeological excavation, you have to dig down. Memory here is like an archive, deposited in stacks with the oldest records furthest down. And there they stay, sinking ever deeper as time moves on, never to rise again. As a deposit, the past contains no potential for renewal. It is over. Renewal can come only from superimposition or resurfacing, that is, by laying a new substrate to replace the old, and then another, in a never-ending cycle of construction and demolition. Each successive layer is understood then to be a fundamental platform, level, void, and hard, upon which everything stands, each in its proper location. It is precisely as such a hard surface that the ground has entered into the political imagination of the modern territorial state. For the state, the ground is not for turning. It is for conquest, colonization, and occupation. So far from inscribing its ways as does the husbandman into the land, or the penman into parchment, the state imposes sovereignty from above. Very much as with the printing press, letters are imposed from above upon the sheet. And just as every new impression calls for a new sheet, so every inscription in the land calls for a new ground. So the ground figures here not as a surface to be actively restored and cultivated, but as a passive substrate upon which to map out the strategic designs of the present. And whatever their claims to perpetuity, these designs are destined to be covered over in their turn by those of the future. Such is the way of modernity. Well, if you manage to follow my argument so far, you'll see that whether we're speaking of the page or the ground, we end up with a distinction between two kinds of surface. One is a layered surface, which covers up what went before and is close to what follows. The other is a deep surface, that covers nothing but itself and yet rises into the open. And up to now, I've presented these as alternatives, even to the extent of aligning them to a contrast between modernity and tradition. And yet this contrast is surely artificial. Perhaps it is more reasonable to suppose that these alternative understandings of the ground surface, far from standing on opposite sides of a great divide in the history of the world, have always coexisted and have continually answered to one another. In different periods or regions, one side may have been ascendant or given greater ideological prominence, but the other would have always been present in the background. It is, after all, in the nature of ideologies to be lopsided. And as we've seen with camouflage, they can deceive by leading us to mistake one kind of surface for another. But the deceit can work the other way as well, though perhaps less intentionally. In many parts of the world, landscapes are dotted with mounds of various sizes, from the insignificant to the monumental. They've been around since time immemorial. Prehistorians call them tumuli. Just how and why tumuli were formed remains a matter of controversy, which need not detain us here. Suffice it to note that any accumulation of waste material, whether from the construction of earthworks or from everyday domestic habitation, is liable to settle more or less of its own accord into the form of a mound. If you're on the beach, at the seaside, and digging a hole in the sand for fun, the sand you've already dug and put to one side will form a mound all by itself. And as such, the mound is nothing more than a swelling in the earth that covers nothing, and is open to the elements. But this hasn't deterred legions of prehistorians from excavating their tumuli in the conviction that buried inside each must be a body. There must be something inside, something underneath we should excavate. Occasionally, they have struck lucky and been rewarded with sensational finds. And this is a lovely picture from a burial mound from Davenport, Iowa, dating from 1887. It's a whole load of skeletons inside the mound. Very exciting. But more often than not, their excavations have yielded only quantities of earth and rubble. And their error has been to imagine the face of the earth as a twin-sided layer or enclosure which consequently must have something to hide, like those tanks of the military commander. But could the practice of burial point to a different conclusion? In his New Science of 1725, the philosopher Giambattista Vico speculated that the very word human might have its source in the Latin word for burying, humando, which itself comes from humus, meaning soil. So humans would above all be people of the soil who bury their dead. They come from the earth and will ever return to it. So might burial establish a peculiarly human relation to the ground and to the past, in which opening and closure, far from being mutually exclusive, actually alternate. So to return to the contrast with which I began, between the respective ways in which Shepherd and Gibson thought of the ground, well, perhaps they could both be right, albeit that each told only half the story. Could it be that as generations come and go, the earth alternately opens up to the sky and then turns against it? Let's imagine the phases of the burial as it might have been practiced in antiquity. First, the earth is open. You dig a pit. Material is removed to form the pit into which the body is laid. And incidentally, of course, as the pit is dug, a mound of earth will form to one side of it. Following the necessary ritual formalities, the pit, here it is, here's the pit, there's the body. The pit is then covered with a slab of stone. And in the grave, this slab forms a layer with two sides, upper and lower, concealing the body beneath. But for the living, sealing the slab does nothing to extinguish the memory of the deceased. On the contrary, it remains deeply engraved in their hearts and minds. And yet, with the passage of time and generations, memories gradually fade even as the vegetation encroaches over the slab, contributing through its decomposition to the formation of the soil. And eventually, after many centuries or even millennia, the grave site is left indistinguishable from its surroundings, save perhaps for a small stone or hump or a stone to mark its location. Here's a standing stone from County Cork in Ireland. That's all that you can see standing up. So once again, the ground of the site shows its face to the sky, and with the grave long forgotten, people go about their lives completely unaware that anything lies below, until perhaps it is exposed by the natural erosion or by the ministrations of archaeologists. So as the story of burial shows, bringing closure to the past is one thing, wiping it out altogether is quite another. Drawing a line over the past or sealing it underground will not make it go away. And just as the insomniac's attempts to fall asleep make him all the more wakeful, so our efforts to forget the past have the opposite effect of bringing it more vividly to mind. And yet, as surely as sleep eventually comes, so the past will be forgotten. In the mind, however, as in the landscape, it fades not by sinking deeper down, but by rising to the surface, only to be wiped away by the elements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much both for the wonderful presentation. I think we have this quite nice parallel between a relatively more conceptual understanding of what ground and turning ground is, and also this encounter in the field in Southeast Asia through all the land reclamation project, the failed land reclamation project, and how that opens up to a very unexpected future of land reclaimed by nature. So I want to ask a very quick question first, and then I'll be open up for the audience to join us. So I'd like to actually go back to the title of this session. So that's senses and making sense. So I think in both of the presentation, there is a very subtle, anthropological way of engaging this world that's constantly in flux and continuously evolving and in correspondence. So I just want to ask how this kind of anthropological sensibility can be cultivated, especially in educational context, as here at the Architectural Association. So, who would like to go first?
You start, Michaela. You have more to say about senses than I do.
Yeah, I might. I also got my voice back, so
That's good.
It's a tricky question because I'm not trained as an anthropologist, but I find myself doing these fieldwork projects and relying on my senses while doing them. But I guess being immersed in those environments, especially in those very disturbing environments, I guess made me really want to find a different story to them, because they are very obviously quite devastating in their scale and also in the impact they have. So looking for cracks in the ground, to reference Tim's presentation, is something that I have maybe not consciously been doing, but been stumbling upon. And this requires you to just be in a place and to pay attention, I think, and to also, I don't know, I guess not have a preconception of what you will find. Of course, you can, of course, everyone has certain preconceptions, I guess, when they come to a field site and they have a research interest and whatnot. But to be open, to be somehow surprised and maybe also irritated, be it by a smell, for example, that then makes you stop and makes you look around. That's something that I really kind of treasure. How you train that, on the other hand, I don't really know. I always find it beautiful if it happens, and it tends to happen. But I guess just taking time and being open, and being open to also be taught otherwise.
I thought that Michaela's presentation had, in the contrast between the mud skippers and the fancy but empty hotels, there was a wonderful illustration of the difference between, well, particularly smell, but also, I don't know whether there was any sound, but the difference between a way of sensing that brings you very close to the surface of things and a way of sensing when you're just looking at, it's the difference between what we sometimes call haptic and optical. So the smell is very, you can hardly see these mud skippers because they're so well camouflaged, but you can certainly smell the mud. And you have to look really closely. And perhaps what you see is not the mud skipper itself, but the movement. You see that the mud is all sort of seething with movement, and you think, well, something's there. So it's a very different kind of vision than the sort of vision when you're taking a view of an empty building. So I thought it was very vivid contrast. Myself, I've been rather critical of the whole movement known as the anthropology of the senses. I don't really like it. And the reason I don't like it is because I think it fetishizes the senses. I'm interested in perception. And in educational context, I say, I want you to learn to notice things. I want you to pay attention. And normally we pay attention with all our senses without really bothering to distinguish very closely. Am I seeing? Am I listening? Am I smelling? Am I touching? I'm doing all these things at once. And the important thing is that you're actually paying attention. And that's what matters. And one can train one's senses, that one can train one's eyes and one's ears and one's hands to notice things. But this is about sensing the world. It's not about worlds of sense. And the reason why I get annoyed with much of the anthropology of the senses is it becomes a sort of thing where say in this culture, people are hung up on vision, but in this other culture they're hung up on sound, and it's as though one's perception of the world is mediated by these different cultural models of the senses, and that gets in the way of the business of really paying attention to things, and that's why. So I would want to see sensing as a mode of perception, and start with perception rather than the senses.
I think it's very challenging these days with all the social media and all this, stuff around that's shortening the attentioning span of everyone. So I think I just feel more and more difficult to pay attention to something. So that's why I think when Cyan and I are doing this tracing sand trip, going into these very wild places in Southeast Asia, because you're sort of been exposed in this pure environment and it's just you, and you can only see things through your senses and not through internet, through Googling, and that actually really help to open that. But coming back, for example, back to London, it's sort of like back to the usual way of, trying to find information elsewhere instead of through senses. I wonder what's your view about that?
Maybe I should just begin this time simply by saying that I'm of the wrong generation. I mean, I was forced into buying a smartphone about a year ago. Before that, it's an ancient Nokia, and before that, nothing at all. And I'm just not. I have no idea how to get around the place using Google Maps or anything like that. So if I'm in the city, I'm finding my way around the city in the kind of same way as I would have always done, without the means of a smartphone or anything like that, trying to figure out, often holding a copy of London A to Z, and trying to work my way out around that. So maybe I'm not really suited to answer this question, but only to say that I think the whole digital thing is going to collapse within a century. And it would be a good idea to look after the skills we'll need for when it's gone.
May I say something? I'm not a fan of claiming that there is something pure about a non-mediated access to the environment. I think that's bullshit. I think, media is changing the way maybe we relate to places, but that is not only something bad. It creates a beautiful distance to certain disasters, but also a knowledge of certain places. A good example from my fieldwork in Southeast Asia is that certain places I would have not even been able to access without my phone because the infrastructure is maybe not so accessible. And sometimes I have to use the Grab interface to navigate to a place. And if it's not on Grab, I don't get there, which is like an app like Uber, for example, for Southeast Asia. A lot of the fieldwork I've done in the Mekong Delta would have not been possible without satellite images, through which I would have detected spots on the Mekong River where sand mining is happening. So there are many things, but then also being there and being close to the sand dredging places and witnessing the kind of horror that people experience in these places. That's a very immediate kind of experience that you don't get to feel when you watch that footage, when you have maybe the digitally mediated experience. So I don't think there is something pure about relying on our human senses as such. So technology can be a great tool to access places, right? Of course, it can also be distracting. I guess it can be many things.
Tim, I found it really provoking, your idea of ground as an interface between sky and earth, whether that's about support and separation or permeation, and how that might be mediated by different bodies. You gave the example of plants through the Paul Klee diagram of mediating between those. And I thought that was, really provoking as a concept of something that we're on the whole time, of this idea of ground. But Michaela, I was wondering if you were able to talk to that specifically through the material of sand in its different mediated forms that you came across.
So that's the questions for me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering how to respond to that because I guess, as much as that is maybe conceptually interesting, I find it hard to relate to it because with sand, I guess what I have tried to show is that what the ground is not even so clear to begin with. And maybe that's not just the case of sand and land reclamation, but that has always been the case at any time, be it during, the pre-modern days or the so-called modern era. For me, ground is not a stable category. Therefore, I don't find it so useful, I guess, to think of a separation between the sky and whatever is under the ground. And I think, sand is a great material because it has been a material that is constantly being recycled by the earth. Mm-hmm. It's, the beach is never the beach. It's moving all the time. So is the landmass. And if we speak of other materials underground, like toxic materials, minerals, they have been constantly being, turned over, I guess. So what is the ground? How is it helpful to think about the ground as an interface that we inscribe our ideas upon? I guess I'm more interested in thinking about, as I said, the geological as a process that is kind of being thought together with social, political, economic processes and how they have been shifting and how our idea of groundedness has been shifting. And Malacca is a horrible example of that, I guess. Yeah.
Could I add a little bit there? Because I think there might be some misunderstanding here. And I was arguing for a concept of ground that does not separate earth and sky. The thing is that so long as urban planners assume that ground means hard surfacing, like a paving, then indeed they're thinking of the ground as an interface with the earth underneath and the sky on top. But if we think of a sand dune, that makes no sense at all. And as Michaela rightly said, with a sand dune, if we're going to use the word ground at all, it's a place where the earth and the air are in continual dialogue. The wind and the particles and everything. And as an example of that, I could say just north of here, Aberdeen, there's an enormous area of sand dunes underneath which is a medieval village. It was completely buried by a 3-day storm in the 14th century. And you can just see the old church pointing out from underneath. Near to that is also on the sand dunes is an atrocity. It's a golf course built and owned by Donald Trump. And we're all hoping that the elements will get to work as soon as possible and destroy it. And they're already doing that fairly efficiently. But that's precisely because what we're calling the ground is absolutely not a stable platform on which things are situated. It's a place where the earth and air are continually interpenetrating and having a dialogue which is sometimes pretty violent.
I don't know, Tim, if you still have time for one more question?
Yes, it's okay. I'm all right, actually.
Okay,
so
thanks.
15 minutes anyway.
I have a question for Tim. I was really thankful for your comparison between the emparchment and the field. And of course, that's geography, the writing of the earth. And the big misunderstanding is always that geography tries to make maps that mimic the earth, while it's obviously the other way around, that we trying to imagine the earth as a map. And I wanted to ask you, Tim, if in your current research you are trying to be iconoclastic against maps, and you're trying to understand them as images that need to be discarded, or whether you are, and this may be my understanding of your work, whether you are iconophilic, you are really loving those conditions in order to somehow treat them as materials to erase and grate off and have palimpsest on them. I wanted to understand better your relationship to the image of the map.
I think both. I think we can't put all maps in one category, and I would make a distinction between the cartographic map, as a standard scientific objective cartographic map that we're used to, and the activity of mapping, which is something we do often in drawing sketch maps. So there are lots and lots of maps which are really just stories. Which you might be telling the story, you might be writing it down, or you might be telling it verbally, and at the same time sketching, showing we went along this way and then we turned this way, and before long you would have scribbled a diagram, and then you might choose to embellish it with all kinds of pictures and jottings and notes, and that's a great that's fine for me. More that mapping as storytelling as a way of reperforming a journey through a landscape is very close to the medieval practices I was talking about. They did that. So the problem I have, and it's not just me, it's been widely critiqued, is with the assumptions built into the scientific cartography and the idea that gives us an objective rendering of what is factually there on the surface of the earth from a position of nowhere. I mean, that's been criticized by so many people, and so it is problematic. So I'm. I think what I'm doing, if you want to say, am I being iconophilic or iconoclastic? I'm being iconoclastic as regards cartography, but I'm being quite iconophilic as regards the sorts of maps that people are drawing all the time in the course of their everyday life as they tell their stories.
Do you want to follow up on that, John? Because you do a lot of cartographic mapping and also...
No, I have never done a cartographic map in my life, and I will never do. That's why I asked this question. I think that the real beauty of your work, Tim, is the cross-section and the fact that you are looking at the world sideways, and even the possibility of thinking the volume as the evolvere. I think that's the real value of the work of Tim as I read it, is all in that. And maps are really something that are so stupid, and I would never do that.
Take more questions from the floor.
I'm actually a choreographer, I'm not an architect, but I've done a lot of collaborations with architects. And I think you mentioned education earlier, and it's interesting to me how one might encourage this understanding of developing a greater sense of perception around the environment, which affects the way you make your mark on the ground, the way you make your constructions, the way you can think about constructing in relation to what we've seen from Michaela's presentation. In a sense, I think, Tim, there's a kind of similarity between choreography and what you were talking about, insofar as there's a daily practice in choreography that when you're making work, you're already layering an idea in different ways. And then eventually you choose a time to sort of show it to people, which makes use of all of that layering. Although you don't see it, you might make a map of it or a drawing of it. And in a sense, one is always constructing upon something when one is making a piece of work. And the dancers or performers involved in that process are also constructing that layering in their muscle memory and in their perceptions as to where they come in relation to time and in relation to the embodied experience of moving in time. And just another point, I really enjoyed the point that you made about interpenetration, because that's what Cage would talk about in relation to his soundscapes for Mercer's pieces.
Just to comment on that, I get what you say, and I'm sure it's true, but I would want to question the metaphor of layering. It's one that we very easily resort to, and I don't think it's quite right. Yeah. The metaphor I've got very fond of as an alternative comes from rope making. When you make a rope from natural fibers, maybe grasses, you are continually winding them around one another. And of course, grass is only so long, but as fast as grasses fibers give out, you're introducing new ones. So you can keep on winding the rope indefinitely. And the thing about that is that you are kind of layering, but it's a longitudinal. It's a longitudinal layering, in which this grass fiber overlaps that one, which overlaps the next one. And I think that comes closer to what you're talking about than actually putting sheets on top of one
another. That was great. Thank you very much. How has both of your research affected your own relationship with the ground? Do you find yourself, connecting differently with it? I find living in a city, I get very disconnected from the ground very easily and kind of don't realize how much I'm missing it in a way. And then Michaela, I suppose that the additional question is, in these areas of reclaimed land, which is a slightly weird term, do you find this newly reclaimed land being kind of spooky in a way? It's like not supposed to be there, maybe.
I start with that, I think. I wouldn't say I find it spooky. I mean, I research these landscapes because I find them fascinating, I guess, in some sort. because they're vast infrastructural kind of projects, I think, and I really have a thing for those big infrastructure projects. So I find them fascinating, and I find them also. I think it depends on the place we talk about. In Southeast Asia, I find them oftentimes also really problematic because of the speculative nature of these projects, by which I mean financial speculation first and foremost. But I can also relate to sand in my everyday life in Berlin. Berlin is very sandy. It's a city built on sand, and the consequences of this are very present when we build a new U-Bahn, for example, as it has been the case for, I think, several years now, and the ground has been just sinking, and the construction site being like dormant for several years because the city doesn't know how to deal with it because it's just too sandy to somehow figure out how to stabilize it. So traffic has been interrupted for a lot of time. Also, I imagine in London, and I think it's a matter again of paying attention. And once you're attuned to sand as the material you're kind of like fascinated with, and you start to see it everywhere. And usually there are quarries very close to the center, if not even in the city itself, to supply construction sites. So you can see these materials floating around, I guess, if you pay attention, and sand specifically, because it has been used so much in construction, you get to see all the time. But of course, in that massive scale of a huge island that's been not being kind of like built on and just lays bare, that you don't get to see so often. Yeah.
The whole rationale of modern city planning is based on the idea that you should be disconnected with the ground, and you shouldn't actually leave any mark on the ground from your passing. So you walk on the pavement. You're supposed to be able to look as you walk down the street. You're supposed to be able to look straight ahead, so you can interact with other people or look at shop windows. You're not supposed to be looking down towards the ground, which means that in that. When you do have a contact with the ground, it's usually when you fall over a broken paving stone and hurt yourself. So it's an accidental contact rather than in any sense deliberate or planned. Whereas if you're walking in the countryside, your gaze is sort of quite normally, without you thinking about it, you're actually looking a little bit at where you're putting the foot next, because the ground is uneven and you have to adjust your feet to fit. And that means that you do pay attention to things. You pay attention to the vegetation, to the roots, to the foliage that you wouldn't otherwise notice, and in that sense feel more connected. And one reason why I love the autumn as a season is that that's when, of course, the trees drop their leaves, and you can have this tremendous fun of kicking through the leaves as you walk. If you're stuck in the city and you can't get out to the country, you can at least kick the leaves about. And the other thing is, when you watch small children walking in the city, it's quite different for them, because they are actually close to the ground and their feet are smaller and they're much more alert to all kinds of surface irregularities or things you find lying about on surfaces, whereas we adults pay no attention to them at all. So we can, I think, learn a hell of a lot from kids and how they get about in different kinds of environments, both urban and countryside.
There seems to be a distinction between ground in an urban setting and ground in a rural setting. And I find that a little bit confusing, because for me, it's all ground, but it's different qualities of ground. And I'm not sure if I agree with the idea that in an urban setting, the ground is all homogeneous, and actually you have very different paving surfaces, and those have very different types of permeability and will respond to the atmospheric effects in different ways. So for me, they're all still qualities of ground that enact a kind of permanence or perforation between it, in the same way that ground in a rural setting would be. But So I wondered maybe
I think if I can come back to that, I mean, I think there is a difference. There is a real difference. I mean, I don't want to homogenize urban surfaces or to homogenize rural surfaces, but we do talk about the built environment. And I think if that phrase means anything at all, I mean, it's an environment which is predominantly hard surface. And by hard surfacing, I mean the kind of thing where you're covering the ground with a rigid material that has a top side and an underside. It could be paving stones, it could be asphalt, it could be concrete, but whatever it is, the defining characteristic of it is that nothing can grow there. If anything is to grow, it can only grow through the cracks or where the material itself crumbles. And so there's a fundamental distinction between that and a situation where something, a plant or a tree, is growing, and that depends upon the mingling of moisture from the air and nutrients, and also sunlight, and nutrients from the soil, so that photosynthesis can take place. So I think there is a fundamental difference between hard surfaces on which nothing can grow, which have two sides, with the earth. We talk about sealing the earth. I mean, that's urban planners will talk about, or they used to talk about, how it's necessary to seal the earth by putting this hard layer on top. And they did it for two reasons. The one was to allow wheel transport, and the other was to stop bad air coming up from underneath, because they thought the bad air caused illness. So there's something really, really important there. And it's extremely important, actually, because of the way in which, at the moment, we are losing soil in the world at an incredible rate because of urban development. So I think there is something important about it.
I wonder, Tim, what is your view about the reclaimed land? Because some of the reclaimed land may look very organic and natural, and there seems to have this indefinite depth towards, the bottom of it. Also I guess in the case of the Malacca in Malaysia, those sand dunes, these are the reclaimed part of it, but people are sort of enjoying them as in a natural landscape. So I just wonder, what's your view?
I would like to refer to work by one of my former PhD students, now a researcher in his own right, Paolo Grupposo, who did a study of the Pontine marshes, not in Latino, but a bit out of Rome. The Pontine marshes were this huge area of original wetlands, which were reclaimed, not reclaimed, but anyway, it was reclaimed in the sense it turned into to dry arable land by Mussolini in the 1930s, and because they thought that these marshes were full of disease and bad people and generally awful. So the idea was to clean up marshes, but then the question is, what do you do with the water? And the thing is that with the reclaimed land, the idea is that the water has to be piped out to get the water out of the marsh and dry the land. And then it means that the water, instead of permeating the soil and appearing in all sorts of little lakes and puddles and rivulets here and there, the water has to be disciplined and constrained to run down designed and constructed pipes and canals. And that's what happens. And it gives rise to this idea of the urban environment as basically solid and dry, and water then being constrained to run along predetermined channels, so that if there's flooding, it's simply blamed on poor drainage, as opposed to thinking of the land itself as kind of naturally, inherently wet, and building and I mean, this is crucial because we might reach a time when large areas of urban settlement become sort of permanently flooded, and we'll have to start learning how to build in and on wetland. So anyway, this is it challenges our idea that the city is something that is built on a solid foundation. And something I've written about this elsewhere. It will be another talk, but what if we imagined? I wrote a paper saying, the title of which was, "What if the city were an ocean and its buildings ships?" What if we imagined the city to be like an ocean, and we imagined buildings not to be placed upon this hard platform, but to be floating in the earth in the same way as big ships float in the sea? How would that affect our perception of the city and the urban environment? Because that's how it's going to be. And in fact, in practice, that's how it is in many cities.
I have many thoughts in my head, and I'm trying to kind of bring them in a coherent narrative. Thank you very much for the comment. I think about the urban versus the countryside, because I also have like this intrinsically allergic reaction to that kind of dichotomy between an urban space and a non-urban space, because I think what we see with the land reclamation projects, for example, is that there is some sort of what are these spaces? They are clearly urban. I mean, there's like some sort of an urbanizational process at play, yet those are landscapes that don't work with concrete, and there is no paving there. These are like sandscapes, so to say. So how can we kind of grasp those places, and how can we grasp those many like instances in a city environment where we have ecologies that are unique, that we cannot find in a rural space, and the rural space itself also being a space that is highly urbanized in most places that I think we're referring to here. So I'm trying to come up with like a meaningful statement, but I'm just mostly finding myself, I guess, somehow disagreeing by this separation in these categories. It's also great to have a dog in the city. It helps you also really to pay attention to what's on the ground. And I invite everyone to come to Berlin, where the pavement is very uneven, and it's also, as I said, sandy at times, or to come to Southeast Asia, where like the eco-green, like eco-smart cities are a thing now, and where the surface is in fact green, though we might also argue whether this is the kind of an experience of nature that we want to find there.
Yeah, I have this weird perception, like riding a bike in Shenzhen in this reclaimed, like along the coast, is a bit like the Singapore project. And riding bikes for a whole hour is just so effortless. It's like you're riding an electric bike, but you're not. It's man-powered, but because the flatness of the land, you can just write and forget about time, which is very different as all this experience like in London, where it's so hilly, and you feel the landscape while you know riding these vehicles. I think it's a quite interesting bodily perception.
Also, in relation to that, actually, so in contrast is our experience of getting to the airport in Bangkok. So that highway to Bangkok, because the ground is very soft there, and so the ride is like up and down, up and down, up and down. But that rhythm is in correspondence with the gaps between the columns supporting the concrete highway, because below those columns there are huge concrete blocks. That parts the ground won't sink, but in between those columns the ground sinks. And that gives a very particular rhythm on your way to the highway that you're just going up and down, I guess, with in a way, in a weird way, in correspondence with how the ground works, I guess. I guess also on that note, thank you very much, Tim and Michaela. And it's been a wonderful conversation. And I guess that's the end of our session 3. And of course, we can continue the conversation with more drinks coming and hanging around. And just thank you all for coming.
Bye-bye.